Hello there. Today, another video about Ardemapt. Today, we're going to talk about compounding. Compounding is one of the more complicated, or rather, really the only complicated concept in Ardemapt to grasp. So I wanted to go into a little detail as to how to do it and what situations it can occur in the language. Compounding in itself serves the purpose of connecting words to form more complex ones. Ardemapt as a syllabic language has only a very limited vocabulary of, at the moment, around 400 words. Personally, I think it will be around 600 when I'm done with all the vocabulary, but that is still comparatively very little. If you look at English, which has thousands of words, and then, for example, other syllabic languages such as Chinese, which has thousands of individual words, you will see that this doesn't really compare. So compounding can be compared to maybe English and then a German concept. So an example of technically a compounded word in English is railway, which is essentially connected out of the word rail and out of the word way. That is exactly how compounding also works for Ardemapt. Now, of course, railway is its own English word. It has essentially grown together out of those two basis words. In Ardemapt, words do not usually grow together to, forever stay in this specific context, but some compound words can be more common than others. So Ardemapt in this way is a little bit more similar to German, which has way more compound words and also sort of does this on the fly for artistic expression, or when forming new words in the language. So a German example for this is Straßenbahn, which is the word for tram, which connects out of the word Straße for street and Bahn for train. So it's a street train, a tram. That's a actual German word that is just normally used in the language. You'll find it in every German dictionary, etc. It's just an established phrase. But for example, in German poetry or writing, you may find a word that is essentially not very common or made up on the fly. An example for that would be Vogelspucke. Vogel means bird, Spucke means spit, so bird spit. That doesn't have a direct meaning, but in the context that it's used in, it may have some sort of specific meaning. So what we can see here is that compound words can either be made up if you don't have the word, essentially, or a new word has to be formed to fit a meaning, or on the fly in a very specific context in order to convey something. For example, bird spit could refer to a very small amount of something because birds do not have a lot of spit. In Ardemapt, smaller words are, the commonplace things, or everything that is essentially a bit more bigger or more specific is going to be compounded as you speak. There are common compound words. One of them I introduced in the first video, smaisek, the word for octopus, meaning literally translated 8 fish. But unless you know of a common word or a common compounding, it is part of writing the language, of speaking it, to make stuff like this up on the fly. But we are going to look at some more specific examples of that now. So, one example would be the blue-ringed octopus. Let's say we're trying to talk about specific species of octopus. We may want to refer to this one, a particularly poisonous or toxic variant. What is important to remember for compounding is that Ardemapt is often very literal. And in this specific case, because we're referring to the name of the species, this would not be done through adjectives. This would be done through a compounded word. It's a little bit of a feeling matter, whether you use an adjective to describe something or whether you use a compounded word. But at its core, if it's usually having that trait, then it would be compounded in. If it's only this specific variant that has a trait, then it would not. So for example, when describing a flower, let's say a red rose, you would not compound the red into the rose, like into the word for rose. You would just say red and then the compounded word for rose, because not all roses are red. So it's not an intrinsic part of a rose to be red. That's a bit of a more complicated subject we'll touch on in our video on adjectives. So how would you go about saying blue-winged octopus? So we already have the compounded word for octopus, smarsake, which literally translates to 8 fish, which references that octopuses have 8 legs. And fish, in this case, I'm translating it as fish, but really sake just means aquatic creature. They don't really make a distinction. Of course, an octopus is not really technically a fish, but it serves that purpose in that context. It's an aquatic creature. That's an important thing to remember really in language making, that we're really just trying to convey concepts, and the closest concept that we have to sake is fish, but it's not literally specifically that. So again, Ardemapt is very literal, so the easiest way to go about this is to take the word blue, which is eimadeu, which is in and of itself technically a compounded word, but one that has grown together. We're going to talk about that soon. And then semai, which means round, and then smarsake, 8 fish for octopus. And then you can just put all of those together in order, which would form eimadev, semai, smarsake. Now, of course, you might know that this is quite the long word. That is a trait of Ardemapt that may not appear once you're learning it, but as soon as you start speaking it and writing in it, you're going to notice that Ardemapt, because of its specific compound words, has a lot of very long words. Because it is syllabic and every single symbol in it only stands for one syllable, though, they don't actually turn out that long comparatively to English words when you're writing them. So this is how it will be written in script, and you would have the Ardemapt word for blue-winged octopus. The only important thing to remember here is to always use the compound indicators, those little triangles, so that when you're reading it, you know that this is a word and this is a word, and they're compounded together. They are not actually the same exact word. Now, as I mentioned earlier, eimadeu, the word for blue, is a Ardemapt word that has grown together. Another good example for this is arksa, which is actually one of the earliest Ardemapt words I made. It means friend, and it's written like this. On the example of arksa, we can explain how language development has affected some words. Very, very commonly used words, as common as arksa or eimadeu, or really any of the color words, have grown together out of compound words. Originally, arksa was ardeksa, which translates roughly to people, food. And if you wanted to translate it a bit more gracefully, it would essentially mean the people which you share food with, or the people which you eat with, which is, of course, the earliest possible meaning of the word, somebody you share food with. But because it's so often used, the de eventually fell away, and the word just became arksa for friend, which doesn't really have a meaning if you pick it apart anymore, despite still containing the word for food. Similar it is for eimadeu. Deu just means color, and ema is just what you essentially put in front of it to indicate it is the blue color. So technically the word means blue color, but deu in this case is essentially an indicator to show that we're talking about a color. So that's an important thing to note as well. Some Ardemapt words have grown together, but you'll find those in the normal vocabulary section. They're not really compounds. So in compounding, what is important to note too is that some can be translated into different English concepts, or in that sense are context dependent when you're looking at translation. An example for this is seesuptikar, which roughly translates to love name. It's made out of seesu, which means love, and ptikar, which means name. You can translate this into two different English concepts, which are very similar but still might have a distinction depending on the text that they're in. One of them is pet name and one of them is nickname. Of course, those words can also be used almost interchangeably in English, but they may have different implications. That's, the art of translating. A pet name usually has a romantic implication, while a nickname is usually just a general shortening of your name. In this case, seesuptikar refers to both, because seesu refers to love both platonic and romantic, and shortening somebody's name means that you know them so well that you to some degree love them, at least in the eyes of the people that spoke the language. So it literally translates to love name, but if you're writing a text and somebody refers to it, you might want to look at whether they're talking about a family member, a partner, or a friend, and then pick whether you want to translate it as pet name or a nickname. Similarly, some compounded words might be person or class specific. We're going to explain this a little more in detail when we get into the culture, but just to keep it short, in the culture of the people that spoke Ardemapt, there was such a thing as healers, or more commonly called priests, who were taught in human anatomy, etc., how to use certain plants, how to essentially heal, and they had almost their own language system, really. They only usually talked about this with other priests and healers, which means that they would come up with relatively specific words for specific things which only appeared in their profession and which may not really sound sensical to people outside it. An example for that is Ardemapt, which literally translates to worm guts, but is essentially the healer's word for the small intestine because of what it looks like. So to a person outside that specific context, worm guts may not make any sense as a word, but to a healer, Ardemapt would mean small intestine. When you're trying to translate or understand a text in Ardemapt, it may be more sensical not to translate this literally, but to write small intestine if you know that that's what the text is talking about. For example, if you know that it is a healer's text. So, when writing in Ardemapt, you have three things to consider. First, whenever you write a word, does this word exist? If it does exist, then you should just look into the vocab section and you can find it there. If it does not exist there directly, then you should look into the common compounding section and see if there's a commonly used word for it, a commonly used compound. And then if that doesn't exist also, you have to think about how to illustrate it, how to convey this concept in a compound in a way that is as literal and as obvious as possible to outsiders. When translating this, you follow the exact same steps. First, check as always the vocab list, then the common compounding list, and if it doesn't exist there, you have to think about what the author might want to say, what makes sense in the context, etc. So let's look at an example sentence, what we have here. So the sentence starts with K, which is essentially just the question indicator. This just means that this entire sentence is posed as a question. The next word, the subject, is poe, which means yours. And then the verb is sent, which means be or am. So essentially this is asking if something is yours. So the third word, the object, is what is actually complicated here. And here we can see how we would go about translating a compounded word that we're not familiar with. So this is obviously not in the vocabulary list, and this is also not in the common compound list. So we're going to have to look at the individual words used here, indicated by the compound indicators. So the first individual word is dew. Dew, as we know, we can find that in the vocab list, means color. So something with color. The next word is Eahar. Eahar means wing. That is also in the vocabulary list. And then the last word is koko, one of my favorite words in Ardemapt, which means insect or bug. So let's look at this all together. Essentially, this means color, wing, insect. Now, this is a bit based on context, but if we think about this a little bit critically, this is an insect with color and wings. So what insect is especially known for having colorful wings, or perhaps being very colorful and having wings? The thing that immediately comes to mind here is a butterfly. If we look at the context, we don't have any, but let's assume that this is correct. In that case, we would translate this not as colorful wing insect, although we could also do that if we wanted to. The more graceful solution here is butterfly. So the sentence as a whole would be, is this your butterfly? That was it also with the example. I hope this made compounding a little easier to understand. If you want, try out writing some sentences of your own. The exercise for today is find compound words for the following English words: window, dice, map, gemstone, and exercise. Let me know in the comments what you found, and see you next week.